Hey guys, welcome back. Now that you have had the opportunity to go out and play around a little bit with fill light and mess around with multiple flashes, your fill light and your key light, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what are some of the different ways that you can use multiple flashes. And there are really three ways you can use multiple flashes. The first is by tying them together with slave units. We'll talk about those. Next, you can use fellow cavers to manually fire those off, which you probably experimented with in the last assignment. And the last way is using yourself. And we're going to go into some really creative things that you can do as a minimalist cave photographer to operate with very minimal equipment and walk away with a really great shot. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into each of these. So the first one is slave units. Now we talked about slaves a little bit back in the lesson on equipment, but let me do a quick refresher of what are slave units. Slave units are basically, they're either little units that are built into the flash or that you can purchase separately that basically allow you to fire off all of your flashes simultaneously without any intervention by somebody like pushing a button or whatever. So there are two different types of slave units. One is there's a unit that will fire off based on the light. There's a sensor that will detect any light going off. So you have mainly your primary flash, which could be the fill light or it could be a key light or wherever that is. When that flash fires off, the other flashes have sensors on them that sense that light going off. And as soon as they sense that, it triggers them to go off. Now the limitations to light-based slave units is that if they are, first of all, in a shadow zone where the light isn't hitting them directly, they may not fire. Some of them that are super sensitive will fire, but some of them may not fire. It depends on the slave unit. We're not going to go into details of all the different slave units out there. Go out, do some research, see what you can find, compare them, and you'll make a good choice. But depending on the unit, that shadow zone may be an issue, and the distance and the sensitivity of that may be an issue. If you have a flash that fires off, if your slave unit requires an enormous amount of light, it may not sense your flash and it might fire off, or if it's too far away. So those are some of the limitations of light-based slave units. I don't really use them anymore. I used to use them quite a bit because that was really all that there were when it came to slave units. And I ran into those issues, but you're, as a minimalist cave photographer, you're a problem solver, you're a troubleshooter. So when that happens, figure out, well, do I need to move it a little closer? Do I need to shift the position? Do I need to change the brightness and the intensity? Do I need to adjust my ISO? And what are all the controls that you've learned so far that you could potentially adjust to make that work? The other type of slave unit is a radio slave unit. And these things, that's what I use now. And they are extremely powerful. Usually the range is, several hundred feet to several hundred meters or more. And there's not really a shadow zone issue. And when one fires, they all fire off simultaneously for the most part. It's going to vary, of course, from unit to unit. And I think I talked about the unit that I used back in the equipment lesson. There's lots of different really viable options out there. So slave units are fantastic and are in a lot of cases critical when it comes to any sort of movement that you're photographing. And in order to illustrate this, why they're so critical when it comes to movement, and I will say that there are always workarounds, but the reason why slaves are so critical to movement, I want to walk over, show you a couple of photos and walk you through some scenarios of why not having slaves could ultimately backfire, and then how you can overcome that using cavers or using yourself, because there are ways to overcome that, but it's a lot easier to do to work through these scenarios using slave units. So let's jump over. I'm going to show you a couple of photos. We're going to walk through what might happen when you're not using slaves. And then you'll be prepared for dealing with those scenarios when you don't have slaves, or you're using light slaves, or you're in less than ideal circumstances. Okay, let's head over. All right, so here we are now over in Photoshop, and what we're going to do is pretend that you and some friends have gone underground to walk away with the most amazing shot ever. and it's just you, a couple of friends, and a couple of flashes. But you don't have any slave units, so you're just going to have your friends fire those off manually underground. So you go under, you set up for the shot, everything's in position, you place one buddy with one flash over here, another one with the other flash over there, and you get your model set up and ready to go. So you go ahead and you yell out, "Fire!" as you open the shutter. Right after that shutter opens, the first buddy fires off his flash right on cue. The other one, on the other hand, he's a little bit slow. He just finished eating his mushed peanut butter sandwich. He's licking his fingers off, fumbling in the dark for that little switch. And eventually he hits that switch right as the shutter closes. Now, in between those two flashes, let's say that you're either holding the camera without a tripod and you happen to shift just a little bit, or you bought one of those cheap tripods, or you didn't lock it down well enough, and the camera just happens to shift ever so slightly. Well, what's happened? Let's take a look at what's gone on in the back of the camera during this scenario. So when the first flash fires off, you end up getting something like this temporarily on the back of the camera. So the first flash fires and you got the caver in a bit of a silhouette. After 10 seconds, when the second flash fires, you end up getting something like this. Now, because there was a little bit of a shift, when you combine those two exposures together on the sensor in the back of the camera, you end up with something like this. Now, something doesn't look quite right when I look at this blown up, but when you're in the cave, you're not seeing this big, blown up image. You're seeing something like this on the back of the viewfinder. And you look at it and say, whoa, that looks pretty good. That looks really nice. And unless you zoom in to your viewfinder, you push the little plus minus button and zoom in, you may not catch the fact that something went horribly wrong. So let's zoom back into the shot again and take a look at what's going on. So you can see, first of all, that double imaging. So anywhere where you can see detail here in the cave passage, there's sort of a shift, like a double. Something's just not right, and that's that double imaging. Another thing that happened, if you look at the caver himself, you'll see there's almost like a dark halo around his legs where that silhouette was. So one shot is of the silhouette, the other is of the caver. And you can get some really funky things happening whenever you have movement in between those two flashes. Now, this is an example of what happens when the camera shifts when two flashes are going off, not in sync. Let me show you another example now of what happens when the camera is locked down on a tripod. You've got a good, sturdy tripod, but yet you have one flash go off, another flash go off, and during that time there's movement that occurs. So here in this example, you can see that when the first flash fired on the background, it lit up everything, but it created a silhouette of the caver. Now you can see the silhouette if you look to the right of the caver here. There's a bit of the silhouette of the helmet up here by his face, and then alongside his arm you can see kind of a dark ridge almost to him. And this ridge appears on his arm and everywhere on the right side of his body. So on this arm, down underneath on the side of his leg, maybe not as much because there wasn't as much movement there on the leg. But anyway, you get the point. You see the silhouette, and then what happens? Well, he shifted, the second flash goes off that's lighting up the caver, and because you've already exposed the background and there's movement, now that background blends in to the caver. So notice how his ear has sort of been merged into the background, and the same with his arm here. You can see that the shirt is sort of blending into the background wherever the background was brighter than the subject itself. So on one side you get a silhouette ridge, on the other side it sort of just disappears into the background. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what could potentially happen if you have two flashes firing off, but they're not firing off simultaneously, and you happen to have movement going through your shot, whether that's movement of a caver moving through your picture, or whether that's movement because you shift the camera between the first flash and the second flash and the third flash and so on, firing off. So the rule of thumb is that if there is movement, if there's going to be movement in your shot, use a slave unit. Now, for those of you who are saying, but I don't have a slave unit, what am I going to do? There is hope. because there are some techniques that you can use to get those flashes to fire simultaneously, even when you have individual cavers manually firing those off. And let's talk about those now. So the second way that you can fire off multiple flashes is by using your caver friends to fire those off. And the ideal situation for that sort of scenario is when there is no movement at all. When you can lock that tripod down, lock the camera down on the tripod, and then you can fire off to your heart's content because there is no movement. So you fire the first flash, you wait for like 5 minutes, fire the next one, you wait for a few more minutes, fire the next one, and you're good because there's no movement. But when there is movement, what do? I'm going to share with you what I've done, because for years I operated without slave units, and yet I made it work. And the way that I made it work is, let's go back to that scenario before where we've set up our shot. I've got a caver over here and I've got another caver over here in the subject. Well, in order to make it work, you kind of have to go through a couple of practice scenarios and have some cues to trigger them to fire it off. So what I would do is, first of all, I'd have the guy put down his stinking peanut butter sandwich. I mean, he could wait for like 5 minutes. So he puts it down, they get ready, they practice firing it off if they need to know where to push that button. And then we get the caver in position, and maybe I have them kind of rock back and forth to make it look like they're actually taking a step. So they're not going to move really fast or really far, but they just practice taking that step back and forth and back and forth. And then we have the cavers we practice. So we might have a cue like, okay, everybody, this is what we're going to do when we fire the flash. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, fire. And then right then you push the button. Let's try it. Okay, 1, 2, 3, fire. Okay, we got it. Let's try it again. 1, 2, 3, fire. And then maybe I cue the person who's the model to say, okay, whenever I say 1, 2, 3, on 3, you step forward so we can have it look kind of natural, like you're walking through the cave and not like you're standing there, with like a stalagmite up your butt or something. So run through that a few times, and after trying that for a few times, you'll get pretty darn close on those two people firing off at the exact same time. Now, if there's really fast movement, you're probably going to risk getting that, that halo and that blend in, but you'll be doing a lot better than if you hadn't run through that sort of a scenario. Okay, one other thing too that is critical when it comes to shooting with multiple flashes and you're not using slave units is that you lock that puppy down as hard as you can on that tripod. You want that locked down because the more movement you have going on, if it's just the caver moving but the tripod is locked, that's less movement than if you're hand holding it, standing on like a wobbly spot in the cave, a loose boulder, and the camera's moving and the subject's moving. That becomes even more difficult. So the more you can control in locking down that camera, syncing those flashes, even though you don't have slaves, you're still going to walk away with a really good shot. All right, so the third thing, the final thing that I want to talk about is using yourself. Now, we've talked about using slaves, we've talked about using fellow cavers, but what do you do when you really get in a bind and you just don't have those sort of resources with you? It ends up being just you, one friend, and maybe a single flash. How do you still make that work? This section is really about creative problem solving, creative troubleshooting to figure out how do I get the shot I want on minimal equipment. Again, minimalist cave photographer. So to explain this, let me walk you through a scenario that I ran into several years ago. So there's a cave here in Utah called Main Drain Cave. Main Drain is a 1,200 foot deep, well, I think it's like 1,300 feet deep now, vertical alpine cave, really cold, 38 degrees, lots of water, lots of wetness, and it was really hard finding people to come with me. In fact, the only person I could get to come with me on this trip was Jason Belinsky, for those of you who know Jason, from California, 2 states over, to fly in and join me into Main Drain. So he and I dropped into Main Drain in the afternoon, went down to the bottom carrying nothing but, our food and water and some extra clothing, my camera, a tripod, and I think I had 2 Vivitar flashes. That was it. 2 cavers, 2 flashes, and we were going in on a photo trip to light up some nice subway passages at the bottom and maybe a couple pits and things along the way. So we get down to the bottom, and I'm going to show you a couple of shots that we did and kind of walk through how did we get these shots using just 2 flashes and 2 cavers. So I've got one person that can, well, I've got 2 people, me and him, who can hold a flash, but who's going to model? I mean, how do we work that out? Let's take a look at these photos, and I'll walk you through step by step the strategy that we used and the choreographing that we had to use to get those shots on minimal equipment, very minimal equipment. And you know, we've got the challenges here that I've just talked about. You know, if I make a mistake, I'm going to get these, you know, this haloing effect, blending effect. I'm going to get, you know, double imaging. So how do I make sure that that doesn't happen? Let's take a look at these photos. And again, I'll walk you through that. So once we get down to about the 1,100-foot level into the cave, into this subway passage, I go ahead and set up the camera, get the shot all composed, and then I decide that I'm going to be the model in this shot. Now, it's not because I'm any more handsome than Jason, although that could be debatable, but really it's because me being the model, the way that I've set up this shot gives me closer access to the camera, because we're going to have to be operating in total darkness here, because I need to open the shutter and then get into position. So Jason then stands behind the camera off to the left here, and I open the shutter, walk in total darkness to about where I had figured out. And I had to practice this a couple of times to make sure I didn't trip or fall over anything, or I didn't walk too far. So I practice that, get into position, and then tell Jason, I'm going to say fire, wait a second, and then fire the flash. So I do that. He fires the flash off, and then I go ahead again in total darkness, walk back, kind of feel my way very gently towards where that camera is, and then I drape a black cloth over the camera. So the shutter's still open. At that point, Jason goes ahead, turns a dim headlamp on so that none of that peripheral light ends up picking up in the sensor, and he walks down the passage about 30 feet. When he's in position and ready, I tell him to get ready. I pull the cloth off the camera, and he goes ahead and fires his flash when I tell him. Drape the cloth back over the camera. He turns his headlamp back on, walks another 30 feet down the passage, turns his headlamp off, gets ready to fire. I lift the cloth off. He fires it, put the cloth back on very, very gently, because I don't want to bump the camera. I don't want to nudge it, because remember what we talked about a minute ago. If that camera moves in between the flashes, I'm going to get double images or shifting going on. So I'm very, very careful. At that point, we go ahead and close the shutter, take a look on the back, and this is the shot we get. Now, it wasn't, of course, the first shot we got. I noticed that as we were shooting that we would run into problems where the composition was wrong because where I was standing, or, you know, we'd see Jason, you know, sort of hidden by some of the rocks or whatever. So we had to make those little tweaks as we went along. But the point is, you can make do with very little equipment and walk away with a really good shot. So I want to walk you through one other scenario in this same cave, same day, where we had to use those minimalist basic photographer skills that we've kind of talked about up to this point when it comes to creative troubleshooting. So just a few hundred feet down the passage, Jason and I go ahead and set up for this next shot. So I get the camera, you know, I'll set up the shot composed, have Jason run down the passage just around the corner so he can fire the light and light up this background. Luckily, I had carried with me a remote shutter release that I had with me, so I could fire it remotely from, 50 feet away or so. So I got the shutter release, walk down the passage, get myself into what seems like might be a good position, and I don't really know until I get the shot. But I stand there, release the shutter, yell off to Jason to fire his flash. In my left hand, I'm also holding a flash, and fire it off, kind of pointing down towards the ground and towards the camera. Fire it off, wander back to the camera, take a look at it, and this is what I see. Now, I was a little bit hesitant at first to fire off that flash directly at the camera because I was worried about, lens flare. Is it just going to blow out? What's it going to look like? But when I looked at the results, and I looked at some of the things that were going on in the water with this little swirlies down here from my headlamp moving slightly, and the multiple flashes showing up here, some kind of anomaly, that ended up turning out to be a pleasant surprise. One of those things that, theoretically this shouldn't work, but in the end it ultimately did. And I really, really like this shot. Now, again, this shot wasn't, I didn't set up, go down, we fired it off, and bam, we got the perfect shot right at first. Some of the shots I did, the water was blown out, or the flash was way too bright, or my position looked really goofy and weird. So this required a lot of back and forth, walking to the shot, doing it, looking at the camera, saying, what worked, what didn't work, making some tweaks, running around, and probably 20 minutes later, we finally got the shot. The point is, with this, using yourself to fire off the flashes, is that anything is possible. And that's part of the power of the minimalist cave photographer. And that's one of the challenges I'm going to give you in this, this next assignment that's coming up. Some of you may have slaves. Some of you may have multiple friends out there that can join you. On a whim, you can summon up 15 cavers to join you underground. But I want to give you a challenge on this next assignment. You can take those things with you, but I want you to try to get some of these shots using the absolute basic minimal equipment. You may ask, well, why do you want me to do that? Like, if I've got the slaves, why don't I use them? You can do that, but what happens if one day your slaves fail? Your battery dies on your slaves, or you forget them and leave them at home, and some of your buddies bail out on you, and you're left with just, 2 people and a couple of flashes. Do you bail out on the trip and say, well, I guess that's not going to work because I don't have all my, my super nice, fancy, expensive equipment? No. The point of this course, the point of becoming a minimalist cave photographer, is to know what you need to get the shot regardless of the situation. Because then if you do have minimal equipment, you can make it work. And if you don't, if you have all the bells and whistles, then you're that much better off. So with that said, let's go ahead and I'm going to jump over into the assignment. I'm going to do a quick review of it, and then we're going to send you out to use your minimalist cave photographer skills, and then to take the cool equipment and the bells and whistles and the toys you've got and make even better shots. Let's go over and take a look at the assignment. All right, so here we are now over in the assignment. The assignment overview I've sort of already done. The point is that if you have an arsenal of equipment and a whole crew of people to join you, then you can use them on this assignment, but only after you have attempted to do the shot with absolute minimal equipment. Because like I said, if you push yourself to master making a great shot minimally, then you're only going to be that much better when you have access to a whole slew of toys and resources underground. And when you don't have those resources, you've always got to fall back to make great shots. So that's what this assignment is going to force you to master, using multiple lights to illuminate your scene with minimal equipment. The assignment checklist. So you are going to go underground again with the gear and the people that you can pull together with you. And you're going to shoot the following using minimal equipment, and then at that point you can go ahead and have fun. So a small formation, a large formation, a small passage with a caver in it, a large passage with a caver in it, and a room with a caver in it. Now, one thing I need to say is that when you're shooting with minimal equipment, so let's say you pull out your 2 flashes you're going to use and you've got one buddy to help you, that you don't have to be limited to just firing those 2 flashes once. Pop, pop, you're done. No, you can do what I talked about in that last scenario where you're using only yourself, not buddies, although I did have a friend, but you're using very minimal equipment. I mean, you can fire those 2 flashes, cover up the lens so the no light's going through, walk down the passage, fire those 2 flashes a couple more times, walk down a little bit more, fire them a couple more times. So you fired it 4 or 6 or 5 or 8 or however many times you need to fire those flashes from different positions to get the shot on that minimal equipment. So don't feel like, well, if I can only use 2 flashes, I can only fire them off once. No, you can absolutely do more than that. Follow the example that I set for you in that scenario in Main Drain Cave. Okay, the last thing on this assignment is, of course, a reflection. So you're going to ask yourself, what problems did you run into either while you were shooting or in looking at your pictures afterwards? reflect on that, figure out what worked, what didn't work, so next time you can do that much better. Next, what would you need to do next time to eliminate those problems using the same equipment? And next, what would you need to do next time to eliminate those problems using additional equipment? Think about those things so that next time when you repeat that scenario, you can do that much better. Last thing here on the assignment, there is, of course, an exposure log, so subject description, and then any notes you want to remember while you're underground to jar your memory when you're back looking at the results. So that's the assignment. And the last thing that I want to say before I set you loose is just remember when you're out there shooting as a minimalist photographer that anything is possible if you take the skills and the knowledge you've gained and put that to creative use underground. That's all creativity is. It's problem solving in unique ways. So when you hit a point, in fact, I want to share a story with you. A lesson that I learned underground, and this wasn't photography, but this was just about finding creative solutions. So we had pushed to the bottom of this cave. We were trying to get to the very bottom where there's some really cool, there were these gypsum hairs underground. And the friend of mine that was with me, we got down to the bottom. We ran out of rope. There was no way we were going to get to the bottom. And I kind of just threw in the towel, and I'm like, well, I guess we're not going to see those awesome gypsum needles. So, let's head back out. And he's like, no. We'll find a way. So I sat there on a rock, thinking, this is never going to happen. And he crawled all over the place in the cave and came back 30 minutes later with a rope. And I'm like, where in the world did you get that? He's like, well, I de-rigged the pit up above. I'm like, well, how are we going to get out? Oh, well, I poked around and I found an alternate passage that was able to bypass the pit. So I've got a rope. And I'm like, okay, great. Well, we're going to rig it because it's totally featureless here. And he's like, well, there's this big rock in the middle. I'm like, but it's kind of loose. So we put the rope over and we kind of finagled it and played with some things. And we figured that, if we rappelled a certain way, then things would stay locked in as long as we were really careful. And so we ended up doing this last 30 or 40 foot pit, got to the bottom, and were able to enjoy these unbelievable gypsum hairs at the bottom of this cave. And we climbed back out, we grabbed the rope, we did the bypass, we got out and had a phenomenal trip. So the point is, there is always a way to make your vision a reality if you can just think creatively. And that is what this lesson, this assignment, and this course is all about. If you can figure that out, how to tap in to those creative juices and be a creative problem solver, you'll be amazed at what you can do with very, very minimal equipment and very minimal resources. It's not a lack of resources, says Tony Robbins. It's a lack of resourcefulness. So remember that as you go underground and shoot this assignment. Have fun. Let's see what you come up with.